In the winter of 1944, the Balkan Front was one of the least understood and most treacherous theaters of the Second World War. While the Allied command in London focused on Western Europe and Italy, another silent war was unfolding in the mountains of Yugoslavia. Here, a patchwork of resistance movements, communist partisans led by Josip Broz Tito, royalist Chetniks loyal to King Peter II, and local militias, were locked in both anti-German struggle and civil conflict. Into this volatile landscape, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, dispatched a small team of American agents. Their mission, to liaise with partisan forces, gather intelligence on German troop movements, and coordinate air supply routes through the Dinaric Alps. It was an assignment that required not just courage, but absolute trust in people whose loyalties were often unclear. The mission, codenamed Operation Halyard Echo, was approved in late November 1944. Led by Captain Richard L. Harper, an experienced intelligence officer previously attached to OSS Bari in southern Italy, the team included radio operator Sergeant Joseph Joe Feldman, demolitions expert Lieutenant William Stokes, and Yugoslav-American interpreter Milan Petrovic. They were briefed at Foggia Air Base, where the men were shown reconnaissance maps and grainy aerial photos of their drop zone, an isolated plateau near Kuprez in the rugged heart of Bosnia. Harper wrote in his final report before departure, "Terrain uncertain. Weather worsening. Local allegiances fluid. But partisan command claims readiness to receive and protect us." On the night of December 9, 1944, a B-24 Liberator converted for special operations roared into the black sky from southern Italy. The agents leapt into freezing air somewhere over the Dinaric Ridge, parachuting through swirling snow. One by one, the parachutes opened, drifting toward a faint flicker of light that was supposed to mark the reception point. But wind and fog scattered them across miles of wilderness. When they regrouped at dawn, Petrovic's radio beacon was damaged, and the team's supply canisters were missing. The mission was compromised before it had even begun. 4 days, the 4 men trudged through waist-deep snow, guided only by Petrovic's knowledge of the terrain. They rationed hard biscuits and tinned meat, sleeping under rock overhangs and abandoned shepherd huts. The cold was relentless. Frostbite set in on Feldman's hands, making it difficult to operate the spare transmitter. At one point, they caught sight of a German reconnaissance plane circling above, a reminder that even here, in what seemed like untouched wilderness, the enemy's presence was constant. As they pressed on, Harper began to question their intelligence sources. The coordinates for their rendezvous with partisan contacts led them to a burned-out village, its inhabitants gone. Only a few smoldering ruins and the distant echo of artillery hinted at the chaos that had swept through days earlier. Locals they encountered were wary, unsure who the Americans were or which side they supported. Many villages had seen both partisans and Germans within the same week, and trust was a rare commodity. Historical records from the OSS Balkan Desk in Bari later confirmed that German 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division, Prinz Eugen, had recently conducted anti-partisan sweeps in that very region. The timing of Harper's mission could not have been worse. The Germans' new Allied liaison officers were operating behind their lines, and their counterintelligence units, the Abwehr Feldpost 126, were actively hunting them. One German report, captured months later, chillingly described foreign agents in possession of radio equipment attempting to make contact with local insurgents. It was dated December 12, just 3 days after Harper's team had landed. Still, Harper pressed forward. The OSS men finally located a small group of partisans near Mount Sinker, led by a local commander known only as Kovac. He was cautious but welcomed the Americans, promising to escort them to a larger partisan headquarters near Livno. For the first time in days, the men found warmth and rest. But beneath the surface of camaraderie, tensions brewed. Harper noted in his journal, "Kovac, wary of our motives, speaks of betrayal from within. We are not sure if he fears the Germans, or someone among his own ranks." The next morning, as snow clouds rolled across the peaks, Harper managed to send a brief radio signal. Contact made. Awaiting extraction orders. OSS records confirm that this was the last confirmed transmission ever received from his team. By December 16, Allied monitoring stations in Italy reported radio silence from the Cuprese sector. No further messages, no coordinates, no signal flare confirmations from air patrols. Somewhere in those mountains, the team had vanished into the fog of war, leaving only questions that would haunt Allied intelligence for decades. And as the Balkan front shifted and winter tightened its grip, the name Captain Richard Harper quietly joined the growing list of missing OSS operatives. The last words in his logbook read simply, "Weather worsening. Locals uneasy. Will move at dawn." What happened after that dawn remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the OSS operations in Yugoslavia. By late December 1944, snow blanketed the peaks of the Dinaric Alps, turning the Yugoslav interior into a white wilderness of isolation and silence. The OSS agents under Captain Richard Harper had lost contact with Allied command for nearly a week. Their last known position, somewhere near the village of Cuprese, placed them in the shadow of German and USS patrol routes. In those mountains, the line between ally and enemy blurred. Even the most seasoned soldiers found themselves surrounded by mistrust, misinformation, and the haunting emptiness of war. The team's original orders were clear: establish radio communication with the Yugoslav partisans under Tito's command, relay German troop movements through Bosnia, and coordinate airdrops for supplies and evacuation of downed Allied pilots. The OSS had worked with the partisans before, most notably in operations around Drvar and Var earlier in 1944, but Harper's team was unique. They were to operate independently, without direct British SOE supervision, and report straight to OSS Bari. That independence, as later assessments would reveal, came with deadly consequences. After linking up with Kovac's small partisan band, the Americans believed they were finally on track. The partisans guided them through mountain passes and forested ravines, moving mostly at night to avoid German scouts. The journey was grueling. Temperatures dropped below -15, and the men's boots froze solid by morning. Lieutenant Stokes, the team's demolitions expert, recorded in a small field notebook, later recovered by Yugoslav villagers, snow-swallowing sound. No birds. No aircraft. Only wind and footsteps. Feels like walking through the mouth of the world. Their destination was supposed to be a partisan headquarters near Livno, roughly 30 miles south. But as they approached, rumors began to circulate. German forces had launched a massive anti-partisan offensive, Operation Herbstgewitter II, pushing deep into central Bosnia. Dozens of villages were burned. Entire resistance groups were annihilated. The Livno headquarters had reportedly been overrun. Whether Kovac knew this and chose not to tell the Americans remains unclear. Still, Harper had little choice but to trust him. In a region fragmented by factions, betrayal could be as deadly as a sniper's bullet. Historical documents from the Yugoslav archives in Belgrade describe that period as one of extreme chaos. German mountain troops, supported by the 373rd Infantry Division, Croatian, and SS Prinz Eugen, were conducting sweeps to secure winter routes back to the Adriatic. They captured anyone suspected of aiding Allied agents. For the OSS men, every farmstead and village posed a question: friend or foe? The locals, exhausted by years of occupation, had seen British and American officers come and go, each promising liberation that never quite reached them. As they neared the valley of Suica, Harper's team encountered the first signs of pursuit. Distant gunfire echoed through the ridges. Scouts reported a German detachment moving north along the old road from Tomislavgrad. Harper made the decision to alter course, veering east into denser terrain. That move may have saved them temporarily, but it also sealed their isolation. From that moment, they were completely cut off from all known partisan or Allied positions. Survivor testimony from locals decades later recalled seeing, for strangers with strange uniforms, pass through a hamlet near Blydenj Lake. One elderly villager, interviewed in 1972 by a Yugoslav historian, remembered, they carried radios and spoke through the night. They looked tired, but they gave children chocolate. The next morning, they were gone. The description matched Harper's men. It was the last verified civilian sighting of the group. By this stage, the Americans' radio equipment had been damaged by moisture and frost. Sergeant Feldman attempted to dry the circuits using candle heat, but the power coil failed. Their calls for extraction went unanswered. Harper knew that without communication, their mission had lost its purpose, but retreat was impossible. German patrols controlled the western valleys, and winter storms made air rescue suicidal. The men decided to dig in temporarily near an abandoned monastery halfway up Mount Fran. There, beneath ancient stone arches, they lit fires from broken pews and tried to plan their next move. Harper proposed heading east toward Prozor, where the British SOE maintained occasional contact with Tito's Fifth Corps. Kovac disagreed, warning that Chetnik units loyal to the exiled monarchy were active in that region and considered OSS operatives foreign meddlers. Tensions grew within the group. Petrovich, the interpreter, found himself caught between his American comrades and the wary partisans whose trust was eroding by the hour. In a later OSS debriefing file, based on reports from surviving partisans after the war, one chilling entry stands out: disagreements in leadership. Some Americans wanted to break off from partisan escort. Arguments over direction and loyalty. It was the last notation under Harper's command name before his file was marked MIA, presumed lost. As New Year's approached, the storm worsened. Supplies dwindled. The partisans who had guided them began slipping away in the night, heading back toward their own units. Harper, Stokes, Feldman, and Petrovich were once again alone, stranded, surrounded, and hunted. Somewhere in the valley below, German patrols combed the forests. The OSS agents had become ghosts in enemy territory, their survival dependent on silence and luck. And yet, one unanswered question lingers: if their position had been compromised, who betrayed them? The radio logs from Bari mention an intercepted German message referring to foreign parachutists moving toward the eastern slopes. Someone, somewhere, had spoken. When dawn broke over the mountains of Cuprez that final week of 1944, the men awoke to a world swallowed by snow. Their footprints would soon be the only evidence they had ever been there at all. By early January 1945, the mountains of central Bosnia had become a frozen labyrinth. Wind screamed through the valleys like artillery, and temperatures plummeted to deadly levels. Captain Richard Harper's OSS team, 4 men cut off from Allied command, were now deep in the wilderness, with no reliable maps, no functioning radio, and no clear allies. They were surrounded by miles of snow, forest, and silence. Somewhere below, German patrols combed the countryside, while partisan units scattered to regroup after catastrophic losses in Operation Herbstgewitter II. The Americans, once envied for their precision and planning, now faced the same fate as countless soldiers lost in Europe's most unforgiving front. The last known location of Harper's team, pieced together from OSS after-action reports, placed them near the high ridges west of Prozor, terrain described by a captured Wehrmacht officer as a hell of rock, snow, and shadow. For Harper's men, it was both refuge and prison. Their rations had run dangerously low, canned meat was frozen solid, and melted snow served as water. Sergeant Joe Feldman, the team's radio operator, spent hours each night hunched over the damaged transmitter, trying to catch any trace of Allied frequency. Static. Nothing more. The blizzard that struck on January 3rd sealed their isolation. Visibility dropped to near zero. Even seasoned partisans had learned to avoid travel in such conditions, but Harper's men had no choice. Their position was untenable. Lieutenant Stokes, suffering from frostbite, argued that they should risk heading down toward the Neretva Valley. Petrovich warned them that area was crawling with Usta's collaborators, nominally loyal to the Germans, but hostile to anyone foreign, especially Allied operatives. Harper decided to wait out the storm. It would prove a fateful decision. While they huddled in the ruins of an abandoned farmhouse near Mount Aljabusa, they discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside, a rusted radio battery, a few German rations, and a crumpled note written in Cyrillic script. Petrovich translated it: "Beware those who guide you. Not all partisans serve the same cause." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the warning struck a chord. It hinted that the betrayal the OSS suspected might not come from the Germans at all. In the following days, Feldman managed to get a weak radio signal operational. On January 6th, Allied monitoring stations in southern Italy logged a faint, fragmented transmission. Echo Team, snowbound, injured man, seeking new position. Then silence. The signal was too faint to triangulate. It was the last verifiable broadcast ever attributed to Harper's mission. Archival evidence shows that at this same time, the 7th SS Prinz Eugen Division was conducting search and destroy operations across western Bosnia. One after-action report from the German archives in Freiburg describes, for unidentified saboteurs in enemy clothing, presumed Anglo-Americans, sighted near Kuprez sector. The report is dated January 8, 2 days after the final OSS transmission. Whether this referred to Harper's team is unknown, but the timing aligns chillingly well. As the days passed, desperation set in. Harper's leadership, once confident, turned to quiet determination. In a field notebook recovered years later by a Yugoslav shepherd, a note in English reads, "If this reaches anyone, we are heading east. Snow too deep. Stokes frostbitten. Radio dying. God help us." The handwriting was Harper's. Local villagers would later recall rumors of Amerikanci, seen wandering near the foothills, trading their last rations for bread and firewood. One story tells of a woman who offered them shelter for the night. She remembered their strange mix of languages, English, Serbian, and something she couldn't place. "They thanked me," she told an interviewer decades later, "but when I woke, they were gone. They left a coin with an eagle on it. I kept it for years." The OSS in Bari, growing increasingly alarmed, began cross-checking air reconnaissance photographs of the area. A declassified memo from January 15, 1945, reads, "No visible signal fires or flares in Kuprez, Prozor corridor. Weather conditions catastrophic. Probability of team survival low." Still, the search continued, though every attempt to fly over the region was thwarted by blizzards and German anti-aircraft positions along the coast. Meanwhile, on the ground, the American situation deteriorated. Lieutenant Stokes's frostbite turned to gangrene. Petrovich, the interpreter, disappeared one morning while foraging for food. His tracks led down a ravine, then vanished in the snow. Harper and Feldman waited 2 days before realizing he would not return. Some later accounts suggest Petrovich may have tried to surrender to German forces, hoping for medical treatment or survival. Others believe he was captured, or worse, betrayed them deliberately. No record of his fate was ever found. By mid-January, Harper and Feldman, now the only two left, were living hour to hour. Their notes became more fragmented, their handwriting shaky from cold and exhaustion. In what appears to be one of the final entries, Harper wrote, "Snow stopped. Too quiet. We hear engines in the valley. If we move now, maybe Livno." But they never reached Livno. When the snows melted months later, partisan scouts discovered remnants of a burned campsite near Mount Aljubusa. Scattered among the ashes were charred American-issue radio parts, empty .45 shell casings, and a partially melted dog tag. The name on it was faint, but visible: Feldman, J. The discovery confirmed what Allied command already feared, but it also raised new questions. Why were there no bodies? Why were some items, like their notebooks, left untouched? And who, if anyone, had been with them in those final hours? The official OSS report closed the case with the cold language of bureaucracy: Mission Echo presumed destroyed under enemy pursuit. Agents Harper, Stokes, Feldman, and Petrovich, missing, fate unknown. Yet within the intelligence community, whispers persisted. Some believed the men were executed by German forces. Others suspected betrayal from within the partisan movement. A few held onto the faint hope that one or more had been captured and taken into Soviet custody, lost amid the post-war chaos of shifting borders and buried secrets. The truth, frozen somewhere in those mountains, would remain hidden, waiting for spring, and for history to start asking questions. When the spring thaw came to Bosnia in March 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its violent climax. The German front was collapsing, and Yugoslavia, once a patchwork of warring factions, was becoming a battlefield of retreating occupiers and advancing partisans. Amid this chaos, the name of Captain Richard Harper's OSS unit resurfaced, whispered among partisan commanders and Allied liaisons in Bari. A rumor spread through Tito's intelligence network: American operatives had been ambushed near Cuprez. But no one could say by whom. Weeks earlier, partisan scouts patrolling the high ridges north of Mount Aljubusa had stumbled upon the remnants of a destroyed encampment. The site bore all the hallmarks of an Allied operation: parachute silk tangled in pine branches, ration tins stamped U.S. Army, and the unmistakable remains of a field radio, its circuitry scorched and twisted by fire. The snow had preserved fragments of maps and personal effects, a compass engraved with the initials RLH, and a torn fragment of a photograph showing 3 men in flight gear, smiling on a sunlit runway. The rest had been burned. What was missing were the bodies. A partisan report dated March 18, 1945, later archived in Belgrade, noted that no traces of blood or struggle were evident. It appeared, the report stated, that the camp was deliberately destroyed and abandoned. To Allied analysts, this detail stood out. If the team had been ambushed, there should have been signs of combat. If they had been executed, their remains would have been found. But if they had left on their own, why burn everything that could prove their identity? OSS Bari received these findings through intercepted partisan dispatches. A decrypted message from March 22 read simply, "For Americans presumed dead. Germans advancing through area. No survivors confirmed." Yet within days, another message, this time from a British SOE contact near Mostar, complicated the picture. It claimed 2 foreign agents had been seen in civilian clothes traveling with a partisan convoy toward Bugono, roughly 40 kilometers east. No names, no confirmation, but enough to spark hope. British and American liaison missions in Yugoslavia were notoriously complicated. By early 1945, relations between Tito's communist partisans and the Western Allies had grown tense. The OSS, operating independently from British oversight, was often viewed with suspicion by both sides. Intelligence historian Mark Wheeler later wrote, "In Yugoslavia, truth was always political. A missing American was either a martyr or a liability, depending on who told the story." Meanwhile, OSS headquarters quietly launched an internal inquiry. Declassified memos show that by late March, agents in Bari had begun cross-referencing German records for captured prisoners in the Balkan sector. A Wehrmacht field report, dated January 12, listed 2 Anglo-American saboteurs detained near Prozor. No names, no serial numbers. It was impossible to verify, but the timeline matched the disappearance of Harper's men. The report also noted that the prisoners were transferred under guard to Sarajevo for interrogation by Abwehr Section 4. After that, the trail went dark. Local witnesses, interviewed years later, added further confusion. Some claimed to have seen German trucks moving through the valley days after the storm ended, their cargo hidden under canvas tarps. Others spoke of a firefight near a ravine where men in foreign uniforms were cornered. Yet none could confirm whether these were the Americans. In the fog of occupation, memory blurred with rumor. The partisan unit led by Commander Kovac, the same man who had initially guided Harper's team, was reported wiped out in February during a German counterattack near Tomislavgrad. No survivors. Whether Kovac's death erased potential answers or concealed them forever remains one of the enduring mysteries. One OSS field analyst, Lieutenant Arthur Creighton, wrote in his April 1945 summary, "The disappearance of the Harper mission may have resulted from conflicting loyalties within partisan networks. Evidence suggests internal betrayal rather than enemy capture." His report was marked speculative, not for distribution. By April, the Allied air forces had regained dominance over the Adriatic. Reconnaissance flights swept across Bosnia, capturing aerial photographs of destroyed villages, burned forests, and shattered bridges, but no sign of the lost operatives. OSS headquarters officially listed Harper's team as missing in action. Yet internally, senior intelligence officers were reluctant to close the file. Harper was known to be disciplined, methodical, and not prone to recklessness. The lack of final evidence, no bodies, no confirmed executions, troubled them deeply. In the aftermath of the war, as Yugoslavia fell under communist control, the truth became harder to reach. American diplomats stationed in Belgrade during the late 1940s occasionally heard vague references to foreign soldiers once held in the mountains, but the Yugoslav authorities denied any knowledge. Access to wartime archives was restricted for decades. By the 1950s, the OSS had been dissolved, replaced by the newly formed CIA. The Harper case became one of dozens of open anomalies quietly transferred into the agency's historical files. In 1963, nearly 2 decades after the war, a former Yugoslav partisan who had emigrated to Italy came forward with a remarkable claim. He told Allied investigators in Trieste that he had seen 2 Americans being escorted by partisans through the Kupres Valley in early 1945, not as prisoners, but as companions. They were not bound, he said. They carried their own packs. They spoke little. After that, I never saw them again. His testimony was logged, then buried among hundreds of post-war debriefs. What truly happened in those mountains between January and March 1945 remains unresolved. The recovered campsite suggested retreat, the burned equipment suggested concealment, and the absence of the dead suggested escape or erasure. Whether the OSS agents were captured, defected, or simply perished in the cold, no definitive answer has ever surfaced. Yet the most haunting question persists. Who lit the fire that consumed their camp? Was it the Germans, erasing traces of their victims, or Harper himself, destroying evidence to keep his mission's secrets from falling into enemy hands? The ashes found in that silent clearing would become the only monument to the men of Operation Halyard Echo. And as the war rolled onward, their disappearance slipped quietly beneath the tides of victory, into the long shadows of history. The war ended in May 1945, but the questions surrounding Captain Richard Harper's OSS mission did not. In the ruins of Europe, the newly victorious Allies sifted through a continent of broken records, missing men, and stories half told. Among those stories was a file marked OSSYUGO/44-45, Harper, RL, MIA. It contained little more than fragments, radio intercepts, blurred reconnaissance photographs, and a few pages of decoded Yugoslav communiques. Yet within those pages lay a riddle that refused to close. In the summer of 1946, the U.S. Army's Graves Registration Service dispatched investigators to Yugoslavia to locate the remains of missing OSS personnel. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel John M. Phelps, himself a veteran of Balkan operations. Working alongside British SOE officers and Tito's new military intelligence service, OZNA, Phelps began to retrace Harper's last known route from Kupres to Livno. The journey revealed little. The villages once occupied by the partisans were either abandoned or repopulated by families displaced during the war. Few residents were willing to talk, and those who did offered only rumors. The Americans went with the partisans, one said. Then the Germans came, and no one saw them again. Phelps filed a preliminary report in October 1946 noting no physical evidence found, but indications suggest possible capture by German elements or betrayal by local guides. He also included a chilling detail. A German prisoner of war held in Trieste had mentioned interrogating foreign saboteurs in Sarajevo early that year. When shown OSS photographs, the prisoner pointed to Harper's picture and said, "Ja, he looked like that." The statement was never corroborated, but it was enough to reawaken official interest in the case. By 1947, as tensions between East and West hardened into the early Cold War, the mystery of the missing OSS agents took on new significance. U.S. intelligence officials speculated that if any of the men had survived capture, they might have been transferred to Soviet custody when Red Army units entered Yugoslavia. Such transfers were not uncommon. Hundreds of German and foreign prisoners simply disappeared into the vast Soviet network of wartime camps. A CIA memorandum from 1951, by then the OSS files had been absorbed into the agency, concluded no definitive evidence of survival, but possibility of Soviet detainment cannot be ruled out. Meanwhile, in Yugoslavia, the story of the American ghosts of Kupres persisted in whispers. Local shepherds spoke of a hidden grave near Blydenj Lake. Children claimed to have seen old equipment half buried in the forest. But every attempt to investigate was hindered by the new regime's control over access to former partisan zones. The Yugoslav government, now fiercely independent after Tito's split with Stalin in 1948, guarded its wartime archives with zeal. Requests from U.S. diplomats for cooperation were politely deflected. Decades later, when parts of the OSS records were declassified, historians pieced together a broader context. Harper's mission was one of several that vanished under similar circumstances in late 1944 and early 1945. In northern Yugoslavia, Operation Ranger, a British-led liaison effort, suffered a comparable fate. Its agents vanished near the Drina River. In each case, communication ceased abruptly, followed by conflicting partisan and German reports. Some analysts began to suspect a pattern, that certain Allied missions were deliberately compromised as political alliances shifted in the waning months of the war. One internal OSS analysis from 1946 posed a blunt question: were Harper and his men victims of German capture, or of Allied realignment in the Balkans? The Americans had been sent to support Tito's forces, but by early 1945, British and Soviet influence in the region was already being contested. The OSS, acting independently, may have been viewed as a liability. The suggestion that partisan elements could have handed over the Americans, either to the Germans or to Soviet agents, was explosive, and it was quickly suppressed. In interviews conducted years later, surviving Yugoslav partisans gave conflicting accounts. Some claimed to have fought alongside the Americans. Others denied ever meeting them. One veteran, who identified himself only as Vlado, told a researcher in 1978, "There were foreigners in the mountains that winter. We thought they were British. Then one day, they were gone. The Germans came the next week." When asked if his unit had tried to search for them, he replied simply, "It was not our priority then. We had a war to win." The United States Army formally closed the Harper file in 1952, classifying the team as missing, presumed dead. But among former OSS officers, the story became a quiet legend. In intelligence circles, their disappearance was cited as a lesson in the peril of divided loyalties and uncertain allies. One retired operative later reflected, "The mountains swallowed them, yes. But the politics of that place buried the truth." Even in death or disappearance, the men of Operation Halyard Echo continued to haunt history. Each new revelation only deepened the uncertainty. A dog tag recovered by a mountaineer in 1957 matched one of Harper's men, yet the location, hundreds of miles from the original site, made no sense. How had it gotten there? No remains were found nearby. The find was logged, then quietly forgotten. By the late 20th century, the story had faded into the margins of World War II historiography. Yet, among those who study clandestine operations, it stands as a symbol of the blurred lines between heroism, sacrifice, and secrecy. The OSS men who vanished in the Dinaric Alps had not died in the blaze of battle, but in the slow, cold erosion of memory, a casualty of the politics that followed their war. And still, one question lingered in every report, from 1945 to the present day. If they died, where were their bodies? And if they lived, why did they never return? In 1965, 2 decades after the guns of Europe fell silent, a discovery in the remote hills of western Bosnia reignited a mystery the OSS had quietly buried. A Yugoslav forestry team clearing post-war debris near Mount Sinker unearthed the remains of a weathered metal container, American-made, its rusted hinges still bearing faint stenciling, U.S. property, Signal Corps. Inside were fragments of a field radio, a corroded compass, and a torn map marked with grease pencil notes in English. Among the items lay a single dog tag, blackened but legible. The name read, Stokes, William E., Lieutenant, U.S. Army. News of the find filtered through local officials and eventually reached the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade. Within weeks, a small intelligence delegation discreetly traveled to the region under the guise of a technical recovery mission. Among them was a CIA archivist, Edward Kessler, tasked with comparing the relics to the long-dormant OSS files from Bari. His conclusion was stark. The location of the discovery matched the last known operational sector of Harper's team. But there was no evidence of a firefight, no grave, and no clear explanation of how the equipment ended up buried nearly 20 miles from the last recorded camp. This find reopened questions that had haunted Allied intelligence since 1945. Were Harper's men killed, captured, or did some of them survive and vanish into post-war Yugoslavia? Declassified CIA memoranda reveal that by 1966, analysts had revisited the case, drawing on new information provided by émigrés and defectors from Tito's regime. One source, an ex-partisan intelligence officer, claimed that 2 Americans had indeed been held briefly by a regional security unit near Livno in early 1945. They were interrogated, he said, and then taken away by higher authority. When pressed, he refused to say where, or by whom. His statement ended with a chilling note: "They were not killed. They were hidden." That line sparked a quiet internal investigation. If true, it implied that the OSS agents had not died in combat but were detained for political reasons, perhaps to prevent Western intelligence from uncovering fissures within Tito's movement or early Soviet influence in the region. By the mid-1940s, relations between the Western Allies and Yugoslavia were deteriorating rapidly, and both sides were guarding secrets. A captured American operative could have been viewed as both a threat and an asset. Yet, no supporting documents emerged. Yugoslav authorities denied all knowledge, calling the claims imperialist fabrications. U.S. intelligence, unwilling to jeopardize the fragile diplomatic relationship of the 1960s, chose silence. The Harper file was reclassified, sealed once again, this time indefinitely. Still, fragments continued to surface. In 1971, a retired Yugoslav colonel living in Trieste handed a worn leather notebook to an American journalist. The initials RLH were etched faintly on the cover. Inside were pages of short English notes, water-damaged but decipherable. One line stood out: "Radio lost. Feldman gone. Stokes ill. Locals suspicious. If this book is found, tell them we tried." Handwriting analysis later confirmed it matched Captain Richard Harper's OSS personnel records. The notebook was authenticated, then quietly archived at the U.S. National Archives under file number XG 1177. The final page bore no date, only a single unfinished sentence: "Snow again. Moving east." That notebook was the last known trace of the missing OSS operatives. In 1989, as Yugoslavia began to fracture, local historians revisited the case. Interviews with surviving villagers around Kupres and Blydenj Lake yielded more folklore than fact. Stories of foreign soldiers who helped a sick child, of a man who gave away a silver watch before vanishing into the forest. Each account added color, but none brought closure. One elderly shepherd, asked whether he remembered the Americans, answered simply, "Yes. They were polite men. They walked into the mountain, and the mountain kept them." When the Cold War ended and archives slowly opened, researchers hoped for answers. But even the CIA's declassified materials in the 1990s revealed little beyond what was already known. The official conclusion remained unchanged: Mission Halyard Echo, lost due to operational and environmental conditions. Agents presumed deceased. Yet internally, analysts admitted the explanation was unsatisfactory. Too many inconsistencies, too few remains, too many silences in the record. Modern historians now view the disappearance of Harper's team as a convergence of forces: geography, politics, and the chaos of collapsing fronts. The OSS had inserted operatives into a region where shifting allegiances could kill more swiftly than any bullet. The men of Operation Halyard Echo became, in a sense, victims of a war that had already outgrown reason, a war in which secrecy itself was a weapon. Today, their story survives in fragments: the blurred photographs in the OSS archives, a burned radio case in a Bosnian museum, and the faint pencil scrawl in Harper's recovered notebook. There are no graves, no medals beyond the ones awarded posthumously, and no certain truth. Only the echo of their mission, lost in the cold, caught between the last days of one world and the uncertain dawn of another. As historians often remark, the Second World War ended not with finality, but with questions that outlived its soldiers. Among those questions, few are as haunting as this: what truly happened to the OSS agents lost in the mountains of Yugoslavia? Perhaps the answer still lies buried beneath the snow, frozen alongside the men who carried their mission into silence, and who never returned to tell their story.